In the early years of the Syrian war, it seemed clear to leaders both in the West and in the Arab world Bashar al-Assad had to go. But nearly 8 years later, over 500,000 people are estimated to have died. The war is nearing its end, and Assad is being welcomed back. Our senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim reports on how it's happening from Jordan to Egypt and now to the Gulf.
The United Arab Emirates has officially reopened its embassy in Damascus, and Bahrain is expected to follow suit next week, together signaling a new beginning for Syria with the Arab world. It's been 7 years since the UAE and many Arab governments cut off diplomatic ties with Syria over its repression of protests that triggered the civil war.
The Arab League has decided to suspend the participation of the delegation of the Arab Republic of Syria in the Arab League meeting.
But things have changed. Earlier this month, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir made his way to Damascus, a visit seen by many as the beginning of the end of Syria's diplomatic isolation. And last week, Syria's intelligence chief and a key figure in the Assad regime traveled to Egypt on an official visit. But there is more. Trade and flights with Jordan resumed in recent weeks after the reopening of a border crossing. For some leaders, warming up to Assad is a way of luring Syria away from other regional powers.
I think the efforts by some Arab states to bring Syria back to the Arab arena seen as a crucial action to curb regional interference in Syria, such as Iran and Turkey.
It's all great news for the Syrian leader as his forces continue to make territorial gains and he strengthens his grip on power. But for the Syrian opposition, it spells an even more uncertain future. Mohammed Al-Qasim, I-24 News.
And joining us now in the studio, Dr. Fadi Ismail. He's a former senior congressional staffer, but he's now a research fellow at Israel's International Institute for Counterterrorism. And Fadi, the United Arab Emirates, decides today it's going to reopen its embassy in Damascus. But that action is part of a much larger picture here about Syria being reintegrated into the region. What are the trends that are propelling this change?
First of all, of course, people now have just given up to the idea that Assad is going to stay in place, or at least some version of his regime will stay in place. That given, now the question is what happens the day after. The day after means what do we do with all the different military forces and other foreign influences inside Syria. The UAE, just like the other Arab states, have a very large concern with both Iran and Turkey. And their presence in Syria cannot be cannot be accepted by these countries in the day after. So the only reason that the Arab Syrian regime has resorted to these countries was the fact that the Arab countries basically suspended the membership of Syria in the Arab League and so on. So now what they're doing is going back, or bringing back Syria into their arms in an effort to rebuild or help the Syrian regime mount some kind of resistance to Iranian and Turkish influence in Syria. That's the game here.
Nearly 8 years back, almost in a sense to where they started, but with a country destroyed and over 500,000 people
Right,
killed.
And since you mentioned rebuilding, of course, Fadi, this is not just about opening up to Syria diplomatically. It is also about the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of reconstruction needed and who's going to do it. During his surprise visit to Iraq yesterday, President Trump made clear that his administration is not interested in playing that role in reconstruction. Let's take a look.
We're not nation building. Rebuilding Syria will require a political solution. And it's a solution that should be paid for by its very rich neighboring countries, not the United States. Let them pay for it, and they will.
So, Fadi, no surprise here that Trump says we don't want any part in it. It's sort of in line with what we've heard him say throughout. We're not in the business of nation building and so on. But a country's investment in a country after war like Syria is not just about rebuilding buildings. It's about trying to preserve stability. What's your take on the U.S. not being part of this time?
Here's a question. Is American involvement in Syria, does it bring more stability or less stability? And here we have the horrible experience of the war in Iraq, which I had the unpleasant experience of being in government, in my position while the decision was made to go there, and I have witnessed us spending $12 billion a month in Iraq while nickeling and diming healthcare and education and infrastructure building in America. That made absolutely no sense to me. And I think that what the president is doing, he is tapping into that sentiment that is very widely accepted in the American public, especially in mid-America. And to be honest, there is no money in America. I mean, the country is in debt. The country is in deficit.
In 2 words, Fadi, America first, as President Trump is fond of saying.
This is what I mean, many years of trying the other way. Now, if America does it on the investment, in other words, we'll put money and see if we can get money back out of it, people, again, will attack America. Iran can do it in terms of if they invest and make money, nobody will say anything. If Saudi Arabia does it, anything. That doesn't mean American companies cannot participate. It just means that the government as a government will not be there.
Well, in that same statement that President Trump made in that surprise visit to Iraq, he also addressed some of the future of U.S. troops. We know that he announced abruptly that the U.S. would be withdrawing from Syria, but this is what he sort of says might happen in the future. Watch.
There will be a strong, deliberate, and orderly withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria. Very deliberate, very orderly, while maintaining the U.S. presence in Iraq to prevent an ISIS resurgence and to protect U.S. interests, and also to always watch very closely over any potential reformation of ISIS, and also to watch over Iran. We'll be watching.
Fadi, how realistic is that from a base in Iraq, U.S. troops would be able to relaunch an operation in Syria against a resurgent ISIS or deal with Iranian influence there?
When we say ISIS, there are 2 different concepts. The reason the United States became involved is because there was a state, a country called the Islamic Caliphate in the Levant, ISIL, basically. That organization is done, is gone. There's no longer a state organization, and that was basically the mission. Now, ISIS, as having people who believe in ISIS, like any other aspect of takfiri or jihadist terrorism, we will have them for many, many years to come. I would venture to say that in the year 2100, we'll still have them. That will always be there. But so that doesn't matter where you are in the world, they will always exist. Here's a question. Resurgence of ISIS, meaning resurgence of that possibility of rebuild or rebirth of the Islamic State. That doesn't happen overnight. That takes a few months to happen. And therefore, whether they're in northern Iraq or whether they are sitting on the USS Stennis or in Nadiv.
What about Iran? He says we're going to watch over Iran from there.
Why not? But again, we don't really need to be in northern Iraq for that. At least not in an explicit manner. I mean, there are many ways you can see. If the issue is just watching, we really don't need to be anywhere anymore. We live in 2019 now. So it's a different world. In terms of ability to, I think this is a question, ability to intervene quickly. Again, where is your threshold for intervention? The president has rolled back the threshold into, in case of ISIS, actually seeing a state forming. In case of Iran, it's not that easily that they can start moving military forces into that region.